I'm kind of excited today because we're going to be talking about chapter 12, and it is all about multicultural children's literature. It's my favorite chapter in the book, and we're actually going to be talking about it not only this week but next week also. And I would like to begin it with a poem from a wonderful children's poet named Janet Wong, and you will find it in your books on page 170. However, this poem is called All Mixed Up, and it comes from a book called Good Luck Gold that she wrote that is basically a poem about her life, and some of it is really intimate because she even approaches the subject of her mother drinking too much whenever she was a child. But for right now, I'm going to work on this poem called All Mixed Up that is in your textbook. However, your textbook leaves out a line from the poem because, as you'll find if you read the book, it's called All Mixed Up. And it begins with, what does multicultural mean? Stuck in the middle, in between all kinds of food and clothes and talk? Listening to bamboo flutes play rock? Turning tortillas over the stove? Burning the tips of chopsticks? Why does my teacher love that word? Is it something she ate or something she heard? Loud drums beating in the park? Does she call me multicultural because my skin is dark? That really kind of makes you stop and think, doesn't it? And that's kind of the way all of her poems are. As a matter of fact, the poem that follows it in this book is called Speak Up, and it is very much the way she felt as a child because she grew up in a neighborhood in America, but there were a lot of immigrants who lived in her neighborhood. So she was Korean, or came from a Korean family anyway, and but she grew up, on a block with Hispanic people, with people from Africa. I think she even goes on to talk about that there were some from some of the Scandinavian countries, some from Italy, all living on the same block that she did. And so when she was very, very young, she didn't consider herself multicultural. That was just her way of life, living on that particular block. But whenever she got to school, that was whenever her experiences at school conflicted with her experiences that she'd had so far as a child, and she wrote the poem All Mixed Up. Kind of sad when you start thinking about it. But the Speak Up is a poem for two voices on the very next page of this book, and it is about kids taunting her to speak Korean, and they, why don't you speak Korean? She says, just don't, I guess. And they said, say something Korean. I don't speak it. I can't. She grew up in America. She didn't even learn Korean, even if her family had originally been from there. And at the very end of it, it said, she says, hey, let's listen to you for a change. The other person says, listen to me. She says, say some foreign words. The other person says, but I'm American, can't you see? And then Janet Wong says, your family came from somewhere else sometime. The kid says, but I was born here. And Janet Wong says, so was I. But yet, she was always treated as this multicultural person. And she also talks about not very often seeing herself in children's literature. So when you're going through, or the reason that I leave the regular old PowerPoints in along with these that have the lecture in them on our Blackboard is so that you can come back and you can click on this and go to a little interview right here on this page where Janet Wong is telling about her background, and it really tells you a lot about why she has written some of the poems that she does. And also on this page is a really good list of some of her books. And one of my favorites, by the way, is that Poetry from A to Z. You should check it out if you get a chance. We're going to be talking a little bit this week about the differences between multicultural and intercultural. Just a few bits and pieces of data here for you. Notice that I have on here about school populations in the U.S. becoming more diverse. Look at what I've got here. And this is back 8 years ago, so I want you to think about this. There's been a few studies since then, but not any that dealt right with this particular topic that I'm wanting to talk about. But 8 years ago, 49% of the students in public schools during 2012 were children of color. Can you imagine that? Indicating that the minority will soon become the majority, and that was from a study put out 5 years ago by the USDE. There continues to be a big gap in our children of color and whites when it comes to their reading achievement. But as you might even see as you're going through this chapter, that a lot of that has to do with that a lot of those students really cannot make connections to what they see in the reading text that they are given in schools. They don't see themselves in those texts. So therefore, I think it's kind of our job as a teacher to make sure that we include a lot of good multicultural literature on our own shelves to share with the kids in our class. In a lot of Oklahoma schools, you're going to find that they are predominantly white, but that is absolutely no reason not to have it on the shelves, so that whether it's your white kids or whether it's your kids of color, that they can actually see other children, not just themselves, but other children as well. I want you to look at this next statement. Knowledge of the world and of diverse cultures is no longer a luxury, but a necessity. You know, they talk about that we live in a shrinking world. The internet has made it possible, the digital age has made it possible for everyone to communicate instantly, regardless of where you live. There's also been more emphasis put on the fact that we do have so many kids who are from immigrant families that come along in our school systems. So it really is. It's not just a luxury. It's not just something that belongs to the chosen few. It is a necessity to become more familiar with diverse culture knowledge, or what we are going to be talking about here in just a few minutes as culturally responsive teaching than ever. Down here, the authors of our book say that an education that is multicultural and intercultural is one in which diverse cultural perspectives are woven throughout the curriculum in school life, instead of just being a focus of a special book or a specific book or a unit. It used to. A lot of times when we were going to be talking about other cultures in the classroom, that's all it was. We had a unit on multiculturalism. We would have a unit on Native Americans, a unit on African American literature, or whatever we're talking about. Maybe even a unit on, this is what used to really get me. Even here, at ECU in order to hit the multicultural requirement in an elementary social studies class. And this is long before I took it over, by the way. The way they would hit the multicultural requirement in that class was that they would have a Hispanic day where they would eat Hispanic food and they would clobber a piñata and so forth. That is so demeaning. That is one of the very reasons that a lot of people question the books, the Skippy Jones books, because they stereotype Hispanics so much in those books. And right there, that's exactly what we were doing. The person who was doing that thought, okay, I'm hitting that multicultural requirement, but instead of bringing in good literature, bringing in good scaffolding strategies, or how could we make our classrooms more inclusive, it was more about popping piñatas and eating tortillas. And I gotta tell you, that is, well, they call it microaggressions. Really, that is going about it all the wrong way. When we're talking about culturally responsive education, notice here, it comes straight from our text, an education that is multicultural and intercultural is culturally responsive. And our book talks about that being both expansive and critical in this chapter. So, children's literature plays a really important role in this. And I've included, there's a lot of different reasons that it talks about in our book, but I've included these. It helps understanding one's own personal identity. We're talking about, remember, those kids being able to see themselves, remember, in the literature. Or all the white kids being able to understand that their world goes beyond that white bubble. Notice it says valuing the unique perspectives of cultural communities. Pure respect. Helping the kids be better people around each other. I like the third one because, yes, we respect our differences, but we also find shared experiences across cultures. Even if it just boils down to a love of family or something, two kids from very different cultures can hang on to that one thing in order to share across. Notice it says critiquing the inequities and injustices experienced by specific cultural groups. We might as well talk about it with the kids because you can't get around it. You know, I've mentioned in class before that the very thing that you won't want to talk about will be the thing that the kids really want to ask about the most. And so you can't really get around it. You should treat the kids as if this is something that we can talk about. And notice the next one, developing a commitment to taking action for a more just and equitable world. That it's right for us to be on an equitable playing field. It's the right thing to do. Right now, we live in such a racially charged society. And I really think if everyone had grown up in more inclusive classrooms, more culturally responsive taught classrooms, that it might be helping to maybe alleviate at least a few of the problems that we have in our society today. I've included 2 YouTube videos on this particular slide that one of them goes through about different principles of multicultural children's literature with some really good music and pictures, by the way, um, that would be really good to keep in mind whenever you're evaluating multicultural children's literature. And then the other one actually talks about the whys, the hows, why we need it, and so forth. It's a pretty informative little video. You are culturally responsive as a teacher. When you do these things, plain and simple, I've tried to condense it for you. When you find good reading materials that are relevant to children's lives, like I said, you want books on your shelves that relate to all of the children in your classroom. And when we're talking about cultural, I want to stop for just a second. Remember, a lot of people automatically associate culture to differences in races and ethnicities. That's not always the case. Whenever we're talking culture, we're also talking socioeconomic. We're talking about maybe even the genders involved in the family that they come from. We might be talking about the particular practices that family does that because of their background or the way the parents were raised are different from other people. I'll give you kind of a personal example on that. I've mentioned before, especially if it's in like my foundations classes. My husband says I was raised by hillbillies, and I was. Both of my parents were from Arkansas. My mother, very much born, I kid you not, on a mountain in Arkansas, Mount Magazine, if anybody's familiar with that. It's supposed to be, I think, one of the tallest peaks between the Appalachians and the Rockies. Well, my mother's family were very poor, and they, for the most part, were pretty backward. And they were very superstitious people. And so I actually grew up with a mom who observed pretty much every superstition you could possibly imagine. I mean, if you started to leave the house and forgot something and you had to turn around and go back home, you stayed there. You did not go on that trip because something terrible was going to happen on that trip. And she was totally into, you could only plant things in the garden by the phases of the moon and so forth and so on. Oh, there were a lot that I respect you way too much to tell you about. But that was a part of my culture that was totally different from any other kid in my class that was raised by somebody else. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that your skin's a different color to be from a different culture. There are a lot of different things, even including religion, that goes into cultural differences. Notice on here I've got ensure that literature collections in libraries and classrooms reflect the cultural diversity of the community and the world. Not just the kids in your classroom. Reflect the community around you and even the world. The students in your classes need experiences far beyond the tiny community that they live in. You're going to have a lot of poor kids in your class, for example, who you might be surprised to find out that have never traveled past Oklahoma City, if they've even gone to Oklahoma City. And I was amazed. I found that over and over and over again. When I was teaching down by Durant, I had kids who qualified into the Gifted and Talented program, by the way, who had never been to our state capital, Oklahoma City. And when I took them there for like a field trip to go to a museum or to a play, or I made sure and I took them to children's performance of the Oklahoma Ballet, and um, uh, we had season tickets for a while to the children's cultural performances of the Philharmonic. Um, that was the first time they'd ever been that far from home. And they needed to know that there was more out there. Well, even in the literature that you have in your classroom, the kids need to know that there's more out there. Let them have a choice in their reading material. Uh, Maybe picture books for older children. If they like the audiobooks, if they like graphic novels, which I'm hoping to bring in to show some of you soon. Even reading manuals or magazines, give them a wide choice. And then talk to the kids. If you see someone very proudly carrying a book over from the back to the shelf that they have just read, stop them and say, hey, come here just a second and talk to me about that. Tell me what that book was about. Doesn't hurt. Culture matters in our lives. Whenever you start thinking about this, I told you earlier that multicultural means a lot of different things. And every child, every person that you meet has multiple cultural identities. And think about it. There are gender differences. The social class, kind of like my family of hillbillies. Family structure. My parents were a lot older than all my friends' parents, for example. Plus, I had two brothers who were in their teens by the time I came along. Totally different family structure than my friends. Age, religion, the languages. Think about this, even multiple intelligences, as in the way we look at things or the way that we learn the best. That's considered cultural differences. Of course, ethnicities and nationalities. Help your students understand that. They'll be ready to explore out there a lot more if they are introduced to a wide variety through good multicultural literature in your classroom. Literature should provide a window. Your chapter that we're going over right now talks a lot about that. Multicultural literature should be a look into any other culture. For example, look at these books on here that had to do with the Navajo, or sometimes referred to as the Dene for culture from these. I absolutely love Alice Yazie's Year, in case you ever get a chance to look at that. But there's also, like my eel and cousin hornet toad, that are creationary stories that go along with these different cultures. Books make a difference. The books you select for read alouds, the book talks, like was mentioned last week, book displays, whatever text sets that you have in your classroom to share with the students, they should reflect a wide diversity of experiences for your kids. There are two lists, by the way, on page 172. Matter of fact, there's a lot of lists on here that I just absolutely adore. But there are two lists on page 172 about families, for goodness sake, from different cultures. And there is also a really good list on page 173 that we could basically call a social justice curriculum, and the 4 dimensions that goes into making a good social justice curriculum. And the books that are mentioned on it run the gamut from a book called Stella Brings Her Family by Miriam Schaefer, about a classroom that is celebrating Mother's Day. And Stella has, I know a lot of you may not like this, but Stella has 2 dads. Look, it happens. One of my students, whenever I was teaching down by Durant, needed a ride home, but he always wanted me to make sure and let him off early before we got all the way to his house. Well, finally, he trusted me enough that he said, no, you can go ahead and you can take me to the house. Well, whenever I got there, I found out he had two moms. And before that, he just wasn't ready for me to find out that he had two moms. It happens. Whether we want to believe it or not, take those blinders off. It happens. It's a part of the different cultures that you're going to see with your kids. But it runs the gamut from that all the way to, there's one mentioned on there about the good garden where a family is just about to starve to death and they learn about sustainable farming. There's one on here about it's called Maddie's Fridge, and that book actually raises awareness about poverty and hunger in kind of a warm and funny way for children. The children that you're going to have in your classes, the differences between them is just going to be enormous. So recognize that there are differences, but make it okay. And always let them not only celebrate their differences, but let them find connections that they have them. Walt Whitman, I love Walt Whitman poetry, wrote a poem called Song of Myself. And in Song of Myself, he uses the line, I contain multitudes. Well, guess what? The kids in your class, each little person in your class is going to contain multitudes as well. Whenever you're including multicultural children's literature in your classroom, you're given greater voice, you're addressing equity, you're addressing social justice for all those marginalized groups. It's always been the end goal. It should be everybody's end goal. Paulo Freire, a leading theorist in education, said that children can learn to critically read the world by questioning what is and who benefits instead of accepting inequity, that inequity is the way things work in our society. In other words, he said, get your children to thinking what if instead of what is, to lead them to higher goals of thinking. On page 173, as I mentioned, there are actually 4 dimensions of critical literacy or social justice curriculum, right where I was talking about those books. Please take a look at those because those are probably going to come back up again on your midterm. Notice at the bottom here, I have that neither multicultural nor international literature is well known or fully recognized by teachers and librarians. A lot of them just absolutely refuse to address it. So, if we're going to change all of that, that means that all of you as new teachers going into the classroom, you can play a real key role in preparing students for not only a diverse society, but or the increasingly changing world, but for what we refer to now and has tried to be not addressed that much for 20 years as 21st century skills. All of this is a part of 21st century skills, and we're leaving that out with our kids. Your chapter here talks a lot about the value of multicultural and international literature. I have page numbers here for you to look at that are definitions of multicultural and international literature. I've also got all of the benefits of it here. Notice I have gives young children a better sense of who they are, develops an understanding and an appreciation for diverse cultures, addresses contemporary issues and challenges, adds a perspective of marginalized groups and global cultures to the study of history. It just goes on and on and on. If you'll look at pages 173 and 174, you'll see a lot about that. This chapter also talks about cultural authenticity, and that's one of the things that you are to look for when you are evaluating multicultural children's literature. It is defined as the extent to which a book reflects the core beliefs and values of a particular culture. There are 7 criteria on pages 175 to 176 to go through and look at there. A lot of good books that automatically will fit the things you are looking for when it comes to cultural authenticity with children's literature can be reflected in a book if it has a sticker on it that says it won, for example, the Coretta Scott King Award. She was the widow, you know, of Martin Luther King Jr. and established an endowment that recognized good children's literature every year that met all the requirements of being highly authentic in its culture. If you've got the books, if you go out and you buy the books or collect the books or whatever, that's great, and have them on your shelf. But that's not going to be enough unless you use them yourself, unless you introduce them yourself to the kids, unless you introduce them to these books that they need to have in their hands. This chapter also talks quite a bit about the history of multicultural literature. I have put in here in the regular PowerPoint a link that you can go to a video of a cartoon that came out, I think it's like 1935, 1936, somewhere. It's a really, really old cartoon that had to do with a popular book by Helen Bannerman called Little Black Sambo. It is very often considered, a lot of people will call it, one of the first multicultural children's literature books. But if you look at it, the original versions of it, there are later versions that aren't nearly as bad. But if you look at earlier versions of it, it is so blatantly racist. And if you click on the little video that I have loaded in here, it is a cartoon that was popular back in the 40s, 50s, 60s even. It was played very often on afternoon television whenever I was a kid. And it'll just nearly make you cringe if you're really watching it with a multicultural perspective in mind. I really, really hope you take a look at that. Notice in here that I have when change first started coming around. The African-American author Arna Bontemps was the first author of color to win a Newbery Award. It was absolutely unheard of at that time. And as you go through looking at this, you might notice that Snowy Day by Ezra Jack Keats won the Caldecott, and there were landmark articles published over that, oh my goodness, you know, it was the main character of the book was an African-American child, and we were talking about African-American authors at that time. Then finally, in 1969 is when Coretta Scott King established her award. It wasn't until the 1990s that we started seeing more Latinx, I guess I should say, issues dealt with. Problems with multicultural literature and intercultural literature is not over yet. Take a look at these stats. Out of 3,400 books that were reviewed, these are just 3,400 books that were reviewed in 2015. Only 7.6% had African American content. Only 3.3% had significant Asian content. Only 2.4% had Latina Latinx content. 1.2% had Native American themes. There is a good book, though, that I want to share with you this week whenever we are in class. That's one of my very favorites. It's called Looking Like Me by Walter Dean Myers. I can't hardly wait to share that with you in class. I will hope that whenever you are going through this, that you will take a look at pages 179 and 181. I guess I should say 179 through 181, where it does go through talking about lists of great literature and some of the books I just absolutely love, like Talking Leaves by Joseph Bruchac and Walking on Earth and Touching the Sky. The Big Red Lollipop by Roxana Khan. There's one called It Ain't So Awful Falafel by Dumas, and I think you'll really enjoy those. There are lists that have to do with African American, Asian American, American Indian religious cultures, Arab, Latinx, and so forth. There are excellent read alouds, by the way, on page 181 that are considered some of the best multicultural read alouds that I hope you'll come back to. If you get a chance to check out any of those books from the library or get your hands on any of those books one way or another, they're all really, really good. Even my book that I'm going to be sharing with you is included in that list. Pages 182 to 183 talks about international literature, which really doesn't get a lot of attention. So I really do hope that you will take a look at those particular pages. As an overview, the end of World War II kind of saw the change in the mood and establishment of the field of international children's literature. We started seeing a little bit more. But whenever you think about it, there were all these GIs coming back from World War II and all of the blend of experiences that they had had and bringing that back to the United States. And there was that baby boom thing that happened right after World War II. So therefore they were sharing these experiences and these places with their children. So that kind of says a lot about why the change. There is a Journal of International Children's Literature called Bookbird that you can look up online. There's also a really neat site called wowlit.org that you can go to and to look at multicultural children's literature. The thing I want to leave you with is this. We are all citizens of an ever-changing world. You are teaching citizens of an even more ever-changing world. We need to start acting that way. We all need to get over it, guys, whatever it takes, so that we won't have a lot of years like 2020, and I'm not necessarily talking about the pandemic. I'm talking about the things that we see over and over and over again in our news, the inequalities, the unfairness, the inequities involved in our society. Be a part of the change. Thanks.